we'd like to discuss the program as a whole. So the workshops that we have here are timed so that you have the information that you need every month. We want to be with you for the whole growing season this year. It looks like there's a big range of having a garden committee and not having one, and working on getting one together, which is awesome. So that's what we really focused on in our last workshop. And we really want you to feel supported. So every single month, this information, we're breaking it down into manageable pieces. We don't want you to be overwhelmed. It is a lot, but we are all here together to support you at the actual workshops, in the listserv, in your regional breakout groups. You are not alone. I know a lot of this gardening work is a lot of energy. So keep in mind, though, that the timing of your garden might vary where you are in the province or the readiness of your program, but these workshops, as you can see on the slide here, it's going to provide you a framework for the next 8 months of your growing season. And when we talk about the connections in our school garden, we showed this at the last workshop. Marcus? Thank you. This garden school work is a bit like a ripple in the pond. It starts with you, this beautiful pebble that has creating ripples in the pond. But when you start it, when you start the work and you bring in your colleagues, students are on the land, and you incorporate your local community, you build this legacy through your school garden. But you need the collaboration and other people supporting you. So we're using a train the trainer model in this program to create more sustainable and long-term school gardens. So again, we learned at the last workshop about building a school garden culture. And there are so many reasons to have a school garden: with social emotional learning, your core competencies, actual curriculum that you get to teach outside, you're decreasing anxiety, improving mental health, and just the life skills of growing food. And remember, you don't and shouldn't do everything by yourself. And by creating a system that you do with your school garden committee, if you remember the quote by James Clear, you do not rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems. So let's create good systems from the beginning with your school garden committee. So again, we saw this graphic last time of you not going out all by yourself and digging up the field, but instead taking the time to start a committee, thinking about your goals, building support, and then starting your garden. You could do it all by yourself, but then you don't have that collaboration and long-term sustainability planned for. So today, if you'd like to learn more about the school garden committee, you can watch our presentation from January. And today we're going to be really focusing on the goals and building support for your school garden. So a school garden in general makes decisions about how a school garden will look, what they're used for, and some operations. And at the first meeting that you would have had was assessing people's skills and interests and brainstorming ideas for your garden. So getting people to the table, yes, but also trying to figure out what everybody's skills and interest levels are to create the garden. So we formed a little bit of a timeline, which might help because it can be really overwhelming to think about what we need to do from now all the way until October, November. So on the top of this graphic are things that the school garden committee is going to be doing. So in the spring, you are going to be creating the committee if you don't have one already, thinking about your visioning, building the garden. There's lots of planning involved in the springtime. And in the fall, there's also a lot of planning. How is everything going to get cleaned up? How are we going to harvest and store all the food? And then in the bottom of this graphic, it shows what's actually happening in the garden. So there's the people, the committee work that's happening all the way through the season, and on the bottom, what's happening in the garden. So we're building things in the spring, getting our fencing, irrigation, our seeds all in order. The spring and summer, we're getting students to help plan. And then in the fall, we're harvesting. So this graphic is in your worksheet, which is on the portal. And there's also a blank worksheet if you want to adapt it for any of your meetings. So we have here the graphic that we showed earlier. So again, please don't just go dig up your field. We want you to form your committee and think about your goals. So when you think about your school garden goals, you might need to channel a little bit of Brene because we all need more Brene in our lives. Marcus, slide. Thank you. And I've been reading her Atlas of the Heart book, which is wonderful. And if you are anything like me, when you think about your school garden, you have this mental image of beautiful wooden garden beds with not a single weed in any of them. And they're overflowing with orange pumpkins and green zucchini and red tomatoes. And students are laughing and smiling in the sunshine. And while that might happen on a very good 5 minutes, that's not what it's going to look like day to day when you go outside to the garden. And if it doesn't look like that, you need to check in. Are you going to be disappointed? So Brene lets us know that when we have expectations, we paint a picture in our heads. And when those expectations are not met, whether they are expressed or not expressed stealth expectations, we might be disappointed. And the garden is no different from anything in your life with regard to these expectations. So figure out what your expectations are personally and the expectations of your other school garden committee members. If you all have different pictures in your head of how things are going to work, someone is going to be disappointed, which might lead to them being disengaged or backing out of the garden work. And you're not really understanding why, which I have seen a lot of. So when you have planning gardening meetings, think about the ways to talk about these expectations and get them out in the open. I know it takes more time, but it's going to be better than what happened to me is that I got so excited and I went out and planted all these fruit trees, but nobody knew how to take care of them. So they ended up all dying, and it just was kind of a sad experience for everyone. So let's check in about those things before we get started on building our school gardens. So we've developed a poster to, aside from all of the growing and growth mindset puns, when you see this beautiful red strawberry plant and your students are so excited, are you going to be disappointed if you only get one tiny strawberry? Hopefully it's a delicious one. But if you are always focusing on the final product of the thing that's going to happen in June or September, and you're not there for the process, you are going to be disappointed and you're not going to be taking advantage of all of that possible learning. So if the students got to watch the flowers bloom, the bees pollinating those flowers, and you're counting the leaves and graphing them, you got to experience all of that learning even before that red strawberry appeared. So you might see success as all of the plants working, but that any gardener will tell you nothing ever works every single year for whatever reason, weather, pests, soil. But let's think about what's happening under the surface, that it's not about the destination, it's the journey. Sorry to be cheesy, but it's so true. So when we think about the expressions that students talk about, this might be for you as the teacher. I say these things as well, but my seeds never sprouted. I'm the worst gardener ever. This fixed mindset isn't going to work in the garden. So let's practice a growth mindset. My seeds never sprouted. I'm going to try again and figure out what happened. Maybe we can do a little science experiment while we start it. So just check in on your expectations and think about how you can be fostering the growth mindset for yourself, being kind to yourself and your students.
Okay, so now to get into a little bit about determining your goals. So at our last meeting, we were discussing articulation of our inspirations and how it's important for us to know, what brings us here. The next step in that process is to have that discussion with your committee, your students, school administration, the people who will provide input at this pivotal stage in your garden's creation. The more you bring them in at this point, the more support you will have for the garden, and the more likely they will be engaged in the long term. So you may recall this picture from the last workshop, and it's just to say, gardens can be successful looking at many different ways and being utilized in many different ways. Capacity now and later. So before moving forward, you may want to ask yourself and your committee, how much time do you actually have to work on this? So capacity is going to greatly impact the success of your garden, the enjoyment you have in the garden. So you want to consider the amount of work that might be required in this garden and whether or not that amount of work might be difficult for future stewards of the garden if you happen to move on. So Addie has created this worksheet along with a couple other examples that are on, pardon me, this graphic that's on the worksheet for you to take a peek at if you want to look at a little bit more, and this is just a snippet. You also want to make consider how complex is your garden to maintain. Does this require like really a unique skill set that might not everyone have? So these are important things to be considering at this point in time. So who will use the garden? It's an important question, and it may require you reaching out to staff to determine interest, a process you may want to do annually or more often. Depending on how much they want to use it or who wants to use it might really directly impact what your garden looks like. So before you ask, you may want to consider a few things. And you may want to propose ways to them about how they could use it, but how often? And will they have their own space? If they have their own space and a teacher brings out her class, are they expected to maintain the garden? And will there be support if they do engage with the garden? As you know, most of the common approaches are that a class has, some of the most common approaches are that a class has their own bed that they tend to, but there's also more of a collective setting where everyone has roles within the garden. Also, how will you use the garden? Is it to grow vegetables? Is it for native species? Is it a pollinator garden? Will you have seating in your garden? Will it be considered an outdoor classroom? Whatever you grow, you'll need to determine how the garden will be used and who will support it in the summer months. Who and how the garden is maintained will directly impact the garden size and details regarding that. On the worksheet, Addie has added in a number of leading questions and checklists to help guide you in this conversation back at your garden committee or at your school. So what will it look like? Addie talked about this a bit more about expectations, and this is a really key part. So do you expect for it to be weed-free and clean, or do you expect for it to be a wild zone with a lot of room for experimentation? So these are two different gardens that I actually built many years ago, and the one on the left was the first one, and I had all these ideas, and I tried to do everything that I could think of with the garden, and I wanted it to be very beautiful and inviting, but it was a lot of work. And a couple years later, I did the one on the right, and I wanted to keep it more simple. And you can't really tell, but there's fruit trees and stuff around the perimeter. And these two different gardens actually had the equal enjoyment when students came out, and it started making me reflect on just how stressed out I was on this first garden I had built, and how, in fact, this other garden was just a lot easier for me to manage. I didn't have to put wood chips down every year, and the weeding was more simple. And so these are important questions to be asking. The location's obviously a big part too. You want to consider if it's getting enough sun, 8 hours or more. Is it close to a water source, or are you dragging a hose 200 feet across a field? Try not to put it directly under trees because it drops a lot of cones, needles, sometimes branches. A windy spot can also be a really unenjoyable spot for students to congregate. Vehicle access can be important if you need to dump soil. So it's another consideration if you don't have great soil at your site. The direction of the sun. If you have a classroom and students are meant to be looking at a teacher, are they looking directly into the sun? Soil tests are another one that you can consider. You might want to also just go out and dig up some soil in the yard to see, is it soil or is it gravel after 3 or 4 inches? And I just want to mention front or back of the school, and just that I've seen a lot of benefits to gardens being higher profile, where parents see it and then get more involved rather than them being hidden behind a school. So it's just another thing to consider. Just a few examples of garden beds here. Each one has their own benefits. We have raised beds, which do connect to the ground, planter boxes, which are self-contained and are good for on asphalt, growing sacks, and then obviously in-ground. All are useful in their own ways and require different maintenance and different amount of weeding to be involved. This is just to show, I always recommend school gardens having beds about 30 to 36 inches wide. And this just shows you one that's more about 4 feet wide and how difficult it is for students to actually work in the middle part without walking into the bed. And walking into the bed can be something that's fun, or it can be something that kills little teeny baby sprouts that are coming up. So just a consideration about size. Also, play around with garden bed shapes. It can be really fun to do that. This was a garden that I designed with some students a few years ago, and we kind of had treated a little bit of these lines as kind of like worms and stuff. And just to point out, when doing pathways, here's an example of a poor design. Right there we see number 11. the students always just wanted to go right through to get on the other side. And we ended up having to take the plants out and put like a stone there. So we'll talk about pathways in 1 second here, but yeah, just play around with shapes. They can be really fun to do that. Students really enjoy it and can offer great ideas for designs. We'll come back to fencing a little bit, but I just wanted to say right in the early stages that fencing can eat up a lot of costs in your budget. So as you're sitting here looking into planning next steps, there are options out there that are better than chain link fence. Agricultural fencing can be really affordable, but take into consideration that both school districts and municipals, there's municipal policies that sometimes can come into play about what materials you use and who erects these on site. Irrigation is a big one to think about in this early planning stage. Will you have summer and weekend access to water is very important. Sometimes that's not always easy to do. Can you get a tap set up in your garden? It's huge if you can, because then the kids can fill up water jugs themselves. And can you set up irrigation on a timer? Oh, every garden I've ever been to that's able to do that, it greatly reduces the amount of time. But of course, you will need a faucet to remain on to do that, and that can sometimes be a challenge with districts. Talked a little bit about pathways, but just consider the flow of traffic and make paths wide enough for students to be able to move past each other or work in a garden bed and allow another student to walk behind. Accessibility, we have just a couple more slides on this before Megan, but accessibility is another one that's a consideration. Is this garden for everyone? Can a wheelchair access this garden? Are the beds high enough where a student in a wheelchair could potentially actually involve the garden? So this is something else you would want to be considering when doing the design stages. And it's just another slide, and Addie will be putting a link up for the schoolyard garden project that will talk a little bit about universal design for learning in the garden. It's a great thing to consider when designing. So I know it was quick, but we will come back to these things later. This is just an introduction to it to get you thinking in your design. And now I'm going to pass it back to Addie.
Thank you. Megan Zeni is not on the call yet. So I think we will have to come back unless she's renamed herself something funny. Okay, we will come back and we'll just go to the next section for right now.
Okay, yeah, we can do that. I know that Aaron's on the call. Let me see here. Okay, that actually is over to you, Addie, for that slide.
So while we talk about everything that needs to happen in the garden, Marcus has showed us lots of pictures and different things. So share in the chat box, what is one thing that kind of caught your attention or one thing that you were excited to have in your garden? Let us know if you see something. It's like, I never thought of that. Fruit trees, benches, yeah, nuts. And there's so many fun things we can think about as gardens. It's not just wooden boxes. Insect habitat for sure. I guess. Ear protection. Bees, yay. Kiwi arbor, that sounds fun. Hammocks, oh my gosh, that would be so nice to go relax in. Mud kitchen, yes, awesome.
Okay, nice. Lots of great ones in there. I saw a pond. I've been to some schools with ponds. It's really neat when they have them. Okay, so Addie, you keep an eye on with Megan joining and let us know, but we will move on to our first guest speaker. So Aaren Topley is the provincial manager of Can You Dig It with the Public Health Association of BC, and he spent the last 7 years working with school districts to institutionalize and sustain school gardens and farms. In a lot of ways, Aaron's been a mentor to me, especially with how to navigate school districts. A lot of his ideas and the work that he's done in the capital region, which I am now in, has been hugely influential and inspirational. And so really pleased to have him here. He's a deep thinker when it comes to navigation of systems. So I'm going to pass it along to Aaren and move to the next slide.
Great, thanks, Marcus. So hi, everyone. My name's Aaren. I'm the provincial manager of Can You Dig It, a community garden urban growing program that works with municipalities to support community gardens across BC. Can You Dig It is administered by the Public Health Association of BC. So before I jump into some tips and tricks, I want to begin by telling a story. Next slide, Marcus. So in 2015, I started as the Capital Region Farm to School animator. One of the biggest projects that I supported was getting the Victoria High School farm started. Vic High is located just outside of the Victoria's downtown core. When I started as the animator in this region, the school district wasn't supportive of gardens. Facilities had this big book of failed gardens and would pull it out whenever someone wanted to start a garden. So it took us actually 3 years to establish it. Part of the process of getting this project improved involved meeting regularly with facilities. At one of our meetings, I asked what their vision was for the land that they were managing. The facilities manager smiled and looked at me with enthusiasm in his eyes and said, "Emerald green grass in every field we manage." I know this sounds silly, but it was really their vision. And it took, we actually just decided to respect it. So moving forward, every time we talked to them, and every proposal we presented, we made sure we thought about how the project could impact their vision. And so both for better or for worse when we were kind of talking to them about it. Along with meeting with facilities regularly, I began to establish some strong relationships in the district. Marnice Jones was the health and safety coordinator at School District 61. She worked at the district office, which meant she often bumped into senior management. Marnice was supportive of the concept of a school farm and provided advice to help move the project forward. At the beginning, there wasn't really a senior management champion, but I kept meeting with Marnice, and eventually she introduced me to one of the associate superintendents. I took a lot of time to foster both relationships. When the project was in the final stages of approval, Marnice would personally follow up with the associate superintendent and ask about maybe an email that I sent or gather a different additional information about the process. This was really vital in the project moving forward. Finally, throughout the way, we engaged both students and the broader community. When I began working with the school, I searched the school's name on Google, and there was a couple of controversial stories that popped up, not a lot of good news stories. So we worked with the local neighborhood association who had a newsletter to get people in the neighborhood knowing that we were planning this project and promote the launch of the farm. When the day came to launch the farm, we invited local media, the mayor, and other influential people. We made sure to invite the associate superintendent and that he had an opportunity to speak, which publicly reinforced his support for the project. The farm was a good news story, and it actually helped the school build stronger relationships with the community around it. So the farm's now been operating for 4 years and has had over 100 students participate and is a flagship project that has allowed other school farms and gardens in the district to start with a little bit more ease. So I told this story because a lot of the time when we think of the process, when we think about these projects, we think about it's the process of their governance system that's really holding them back from being successful. In reality, people hold up structures and systems. Relationships are the foundation to getting support. While there was an overall vision for the project, we took time to understand what someone would get from this project that was working in the district for being successful. So we made sure whenever we talked to them that we were really framing it in that way of what they wanted to see from it and what they were going to get. One of the most important pieces of advice I've ever been given in my career is ask me what I can do, don't ask me what I can't do. This means understanding that people have roles and responsibilities. So with Marnice, the health and safety coordinator at the district, she couldn't approve the project or even sit at the senior management tables. However, she was often in contact with senior management, and she could make sure that the project that we were wanting to do didn't fall off the side of their desk. I never got mad at her when we hit a roadblock. Together, we problem solved. Media can also be a really dangerous but useful tool when you're trying to build support for a project. We tried to ensure that every article had a positive framing about the school farm. We made sure to let senior management know we were promoting the project through media. And then whenever we had the opportunity, we tried to actually get quotes from them about how great the project is. We were finding that the more they were talking about how great the project was to media, the more they think the project was actually great. Next, great. So while the foundation really for this work is relationships, there are also some important pieces to know within the school district governance system that could really support or hinder your project getting started. The first is understanding the policies and strategic plans that support outdoor growing and learning and sustainability, all those different kinds of pieces. These can be used to make cases for why your project should happen. It also lets you understand if there's maybe major policies to navigate or to change. The budget's another important piece. Whenever we worked with the school district, we assumed they had no money. We actually tried to avoid that being a factor on whether or not the project should move forward. I realize sometimes that's actually really hard to avoid. So try to be careful on how much you're asking for and when you're asking for it. Asking before a budgeting process could swing in your favor when the school district is deciding where to allocate funds for the following year. Really, it's all about understanding these timelines and processes. So for example, most senior management actually have more time during the summer to plan. They don't get the summer off. They're planning for the next year. So this is really when it's best to have like some of these bigger conversations with them. We also know that facilities is really busy during the summer. So we tried to only really engage them during the winter months. I'd also watch media and tried not to email or make beg asks of the school district if something wasn't going well. If you're going to talk to so for example, if you folks are going to talk to your principal and they just had to deal with an angry parent, they may not be as receptive of the project getting started. So while there's a lot of moving pieces to getting a project started, the first step is really building those relationships. You're not alone, and you're going to find that the more excited you are and the more space you make for people to take ownership and get excited about the project as well, the more champions are going to come out of the woodwork. So thanks.
Thanks so much, Aaren. We really appreciate you popping in there and telling us about that story. It's you coming in for 7 minutes or whatever it was does not talk about the years that I know that you worked on that. And obviously, not every garden project is going to look like that. You were trying to really make a change in how gardens were perceived by being having like a local farmer in an urban context who was able to actually use some of the produce for sale. So it was a very complex thing to navigate, and just to show that these are possibilities, that school gardens, school districts can have policies that can seem really rigid sometimes, but these can be overcome, and they need to be overcome often with like ideas or examples of success elsewhere. And so it's important to look around. I just put a couple things here just to consider about school policies, because not every school district has them, right? But so that's something you might want to be looking into, because it can really slow down the process if there is one. And it might make you think that this year is not the best year, but perhaps next year we would want to. There are some really good documents that Addie has uploaded into the portal that shows Surrey's guide that they have. Vancouver has a great guide as well. And so take a look into that, see what you can find in terms of resources on our page. So, what does the process look like? What could be the timeline for doing it? What kind of design restrictions might come into place? So can you build a structure? Can you dig in this area? Like I mentioned about fencing before, but these can be municipal considerations too. If you're building close to a sidewalk or near a corner, that could be an obstruction for view for a driver. So these are some other things to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind if you are coming up against roadblocks is to understand your school district's strategic plans, because sometimes they may be talking about something like climate change or something about food security or something, and you can align your garden with that. If it doesn't seem like if there seems like there's barriers for you getting the kind of project you want to see, and maybe it's coming a different route. We will also be uploading a greening application form that Aaren, myself, and Janelle Hatch from Island Health here worked on with SD61 a couple years ago. And it was essentially a process document that facilities at the school district worked with us to show what they look for, what they would like to see, what kind of considerations that they are wanting to see when moving through a process such as this. So we'll also be sharing that. So thanks again, Aaren, for joining us. We really appreciate it.
thinking about garden planning with your class, it is tricky, but it is possible to do it with 25 to 30 tiny humans. So at our March 8th, which is in 3 weeks, it's very soon, our March 8th workshop, we are going to have a ton of resources for you to use with your class. So how do you do this with your students? It's a little tricky, but it creates more playful, more creative spaces, because this garden is about the students. It's not about you and your expectations of perfection. It is about the students and providing them a place to play and to be and to learn. So when you at this point in February, you can be brainstorming ideas with your students. So have loose parts on the table. You can have Play-Doh and markers and paper. Go into the space, take some deep breaths, look around, notice how wet is the soil? Where is the sun? Where is the wind coming from? What is there already? And think about how we can use the space. And you can facilitate these really wonderful sessions with your class. So I did this once and the kids came up with this whole idea to have a pond, and like we ended up putting a water feature in, and it was the students that got to inform the process. And these are some ideas, some questions that you could ask to your students and think about, well, what do we want in the space? And then what are we going to do with the food that we create here? And you could do some surveys, some math. You could all sorts of possibilities for integrating the curriculum just into the brainstorming process. So when you think about mapping, that's another wonderful idea that you can do with your class. So after you've brainstormed a bunch of ideas and ways to use your garden, you can have all of these different maps that you can create. So for ADST, you can have students design beds. You can calculate the volume of them, and using math for science, thinking about the plant needs, soil health, composting, PHE, it's all being outside and moving